Today, I'm on my travels, flying to, of all places, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, very far from London, where I have been invited to attend, together with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, a business conference, which will provide an opportunity for both of us to meet and discuss and do programs together, something we have not been able to do for a very long time. Given that there are time urgencies, this is going to be a shorter video than usual, and obviously I'm going to have to focus more narrowly than I usually do on the events of the last 24 hours. But before I do, and before I get into the topics of this program, let me first of all express my very, very great thanks to the extraordinarily kind words that Robert Kennedy Jr. Said about the Duran, and by the way, myself, in a program he did with the amazing Jim Webb just the other day. I was really extraordinarily moved by the kindness and generosity of the words that we use to describe the work we do and my work. And by the way, my wife also, who actually follows Robert Kennedy closely and is a great admirer of his, not that they agree on every topic, just saying. But anyway, my wife was absolutely overwhelmed with joy and gratitude when she heard his very kind words about me. And by the way, the very kind words that Jim Webb also said. So let me say, first of all, they were hugely appreciated, and I am very grateful. Now, since we have problems with time today, I'm going to go straight into today's program, and I'm going to follow up what I was saying yesterday about the overall military situation in Ukraine. I still get the very powerful sense that Western policymakers, Western commentators, still find it very difficult to understand how rapidly the situation in Ukraine, for Ukraine, is deteriorating. The Ukrainians themselves, of course, understand this, though they are not, I think, being altogether forthcoming about what is happening. When I say the Ukrainians, I should make it very clear, I do not mean Ukrainians, the vast majority of Ukrainians, the Ukrainians who fight on the battlefields, the soldiers who fight and die and who get wounded, and who, when they are interviewed by Western journalists, are increasingly forthright about the problems that they experience. I'm not talking about the various reporting channels and mapping projects that function in Ukraine, which obviously have their own very strong biases, but which nonetheless do make a serious effort, at least some of the time, in fact, much of the time, to provide work, accurate work, and commentary about what is going on the battlefields. Nor, I should say, am I necessarily talking about the entirety of the Ukrainian media. Mostly, of course, the media has to be very careful about what it says in Ukraine now, and mostly it echoes very closely, follows very closely the government line, and you find lots of commentaries in the Ukrainian media which, to be frank, I find difficult from an ideological point of view, and I am choosing again my words extremely carefully. I mean, I don't agree with what is said at all. In fact, on many occasions, I am frankly shocked by it. But there are every so often outstanding commentaries in the Ukrainian media as well. I discussed one recently, published by Ukrainska Pravda. You'll find interesting commentaries appearing from time to time, even in places like the Kiev Independent, and of course the reporting projects, the mapping projects, they do really try hard. But the government, it seems to me, is playing a very complicated game, and one which I think is misleading and ultimately contrary to Ukraine's interests. I think when a nation finds itself in a state of war, when everything is going as badly as it is at the moment in the war, a government needs to be honest with its people about the problems that are accumulating. And I think it also needs to be honest with its allies. And I get the sense that Ukraine is not being fully honest with its allies. The fact that it is still talking about victory, for example, witness Zelensky's victory plan, the fact that it refuses to conduct an open and frank discussion about Ukraine's actual prospects and actual choices in a situation which is deteriorating very fast. The fact that President Zelensky continues to insist that casualties on the battlefronts, the number of deaths that Ukraine is suffering, are less than the 80,000, much less than the 80,000 that was recently reported in the Wall Street Journal, when I think the vast majority of people in Ukraine and the vast majority of people who follow the war and who follow specifically what the various soldiers say know or sense that it must be much higher in reality than the 80,000 that the Wall Street Journal say. Well, when all of that happens, when the Ukrainian authorities continue to provide understated figures for their own losses and absurdly overinflated figures for Russian losses, figures that cannot, in the case of Russian losses, be corroborated and certainly are not corroborated by the Mediazona project, which, by the way, has relaxed some of its rules. When all that happens, I think there is a danger of a false image being constructed, and it's a false image which is distorting understanding and decisions in Ukraine and in the West, and I think that is extremely unhelpful. I think Ukrainian society, if I may say, because I know there's lots of talk about morale and the importance of morale and the need to preserve morale, I think Ukrainian society, finding itself in a state of war, would actually welcome a degree of frankness and straightforwardness from the Ukrainian government. And in terms of Western leaders and the debate that is taking place in Ukraine, I think it would help them make proper decisions rather than flawed ones. Now, these comments have, to some extent, been influenced by another commentary about the situation in Ukraine that I've read in the London Times by Mark Galeotti. He is, but if I may say, someone I've followed for many years. I found him an intelligent and sometimes insightful man in his discussions about Russia and Russian military affairs. I would say that his views and mine have steadily diverged over the years, where we started from similar, though not identical, perspectives. His perspectives have become much more conventional, and mine have not. I'm being, again, careful about what I say here. But anyway, the latest piece that he's written in the London Times, which I do not propose to discuss in detail, sort of accepts that the war is not going well, but seems to think that the worst outcome that could happen for Ukraine is that because of the enormous losses that the Russians are supposed to have suffered, the war just degenerates into stalemates, bursts of military activity from time to time, sudden advances by one side or another, interspersed with long periods of calm on particular battlefronts. I think that this is a completely wrong and misleading picture. I don't think that is the state of the war at all. And I don't think that any possible scenario will lead us to that outcome. I think what we're seeing instead is a remorseless Russian advance right across the battlefronts, terrible losses suffered by Ukraine every day, a Russian military that is getting stronger, and more territories and more important positions falling under Russian control, even as the war gradually approaches its end point. And when I say end point, I mean an end point which will be translated into some kind of decisive Russian military victory, unless the diplomacy intervenes and delivers another outcome. Anyway, that's first point I wanted to make about the war. I think that President Zelensky is now in the United States. He's tending to meet all sorts of people, President Biden, Vice President Harris, Donald Trump, others. He's brought his victory plan, as he calls it, with him. The Financial Times euphemistically says that he's seeking cast iron security guarantees from the United States, which is a euphemistic way of saying that he is seeking immediate or very rapid NATO entry. I don't understand, by the way, why the Financial Times is not being explicit about this, given that other media outlets in the West are being so. But anyway, that's a matter for the Financial Times. Maybe they don't want too many people writing letters to the Financial Times and posting comments on the threads saying that they strongly disagree with this approach. I don't know. But anyway, Zelensky is in the United States, as he's bringing his victory plan with him. I think the thing that in the West people need to understand is that there is no victory possible in this war in Ukraine now. The only question is whether we're going to have a limited geopolitical defeat or a geopolitical disaster, or whether we could lurch into a cataclysm of a direct confrontation, military confrontation with the Russians, which could put all humanity and indeed life on Earth at risk. Those are the actual choices in this war. There is no route to victory. By the way, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis made that very point, as I remember, 2.5 years ago when the conflict began. He said that there is no clear line, no clear route to a Ukrainian military victory. He was right then, and we can see, if we are honest with ourselves, the truth of that now. The only question is how the damage that we have brought on the West, on ourselves, and the far greater damage that has been done to Ukraine can be limited. And by the way, given the realities, that is now a matter of growing and increasing urgency. Anyway, that's one point I wanted to say. I think that honesty about the situation and about the causes of it is also a priority. There has been an excoriating editorial in the Chinese newspaper, Global Times, which, as I've discussed many times, is effectively, essentially, a media outlet through which the Chinese government articulates its views and conveys them to the English-speaking world. Anyway, Global Times has written an excoriating piece pointing out how disastrous the relentless policy of NATO eastward expansion has been, how it has brought about a war in Europe, a war which NATO and the West are in effect losing. Again, because of the time constraints, I'm not going to go through this article. Actually, it's not an article, it's an editorial in Global Times in detail, but one can find it there. It's necessary, it seems to me, that honest discussion about whether the whole policy of NATO eastward expansion had any reality to it, had any logical sense to it, needs to be addressed now. And in terms of negotiations, proposals that are being now floated apparently in Western capitals to try to find some kind of way, not to end the war, but to try and achieve some kind of a ceasefire, I think that people in the West ought to start doing that which Eve Smith said they never do. She made the point many months ago that in the West, people spend all their time, Western governments spend all their time negotiating positions, future positions, ahead of talks with each other, disregarding what the other side might be thinking, so that when the other side says no, the West goes away bewildered and shocked and doesn't understand why its proposals, negotiated and argued about over such a protracted period between the various players, why those proposals have been rejected. And the Russian Foreign Ministry has made that very same and precise point today. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman has been saying that if the West is serious about negotiations, they need to start taking seriously Russian interests and Russian security concerns. If they fail to do that, if they come up with proposals, as they still seem to be doing, which are detached from that issue, that core issue, then, of course, there will be no peace, the war will go on, and the Russians will continue. The Russians took the decisions that they did back in February and March 2022 precisely because they felt that their national interests and security concerns were not being heeded or treated as legitimate by the West. And given that they are now in a far stronger position than the one they were in February 2022, they're not going to moderate their position now simply because the West wants them to. Anyway, these comments all lead me now to a discussion of the overall military situation in Ukraine, and I'm going to begin by saying that there's been a lot of excitement again on some parts of the internet because there have been further claims about Ukrainian attacks on ammunition dumps. There's been more pictures of big clouds and flashes, smoke coming from various locations inside Russia, and people are drawing all sorts of dramatic conclusions, including, I am sure, the wrong conclusion that these strikes were conducted with Western missiles. I don't see, by the way, how that would be physically possible. I don't see how these Western missiles could reach these locations. Clearly, these were attacks carried out by drones. Clearly, some of these drones are now becoming sophisticated, of that there is no doubt whatsoever. What the exact nature of the targets are that have been attacked and how much damage has been done, that I'm afraid I'm going to leave to others because, as I've said many times, I am not in a position to assess the photographs and pictures that come ultimately from satellites. All I would say is this: by this stage in the war, we have had many examples of attacks Ukrainian attacks with drones on installations, Russian military installations in Crimea, in Krasnodar, in the Donbass. There's always enormous excitement about them when they happen. People talk about dozens of aircraft, Russian aircraft, being destroyed. They talk about Russian ammunition depots or warehouses or military locations or barracks being hit, about large numbers of Russian casualties, about warships being destroyed as well. And there's always far more excitement and euphoria about these attacks in the media, both in Ukraine and in the West, than these attacks merit. Because what we have seen ever since these first attacks began, roughly 2 years ago, they have made no difference to the outcome of the fighting. I have never seen a single one of these attacks slow down the Russians or throw them off balance or do anything on the actual battle lines where it in fact matters. So these attacks may create flashes and smoke and that sort of thing, and no doubt they do kill people, which by the way is a tragedy. But ultimately, they make no difference. By this point in the war, this ought to be obvious. If attacks of this kind changed anything, by now we would not be in the military situation. Ukraine would not be in the military situation in which it is. And I'm going to say that, as we will see, over the last 24 hours, there's been no sign that the Russian offensive has slowed down or done any such thing. The Russians seem to be pressing forward with their advances pretty much everywhere along the battlefronts. So let's start first of all. Let's go from north to south. Let's talk about the situation in Kursk region. First of all, Group of Forces North have provided us with a daily update of what they say has been happening over the last 24 hours. And they say that they have been making further advances. They say that they've repelled attacks by the Ukrainians in the Malaya Lochnia area. I say that because the Ukrainians, some people in Ukraine, are claiming that Ukrainian troops have surrounded the Russians in Malaya Lochnia. Well, I am not there. Perhaps that is what has happened. It has happened before. I am deeply skeptical. It would be completely contrary to the entire direction of travel of events in the Kursk battle area. Suffice to say that Group of Forces North claims that they have advanced a further 500 meters over the last 24 hours. I've expressed skepticism or confusion as to what exactly that means, but suffice to say that they claim that they're still advancing, and if you read their report carefully, they say that the attack on Malaya Lochnia, which did take place, has been repelled, and they also say that they are still advancing in the Plekhovo area, where they have countered the latest Ukrainian counterattack. And of course, Plekhovo is very important, as I discussed in my program yesterday. If the Russians capture Plekhovo, which is located southeast of Sudzha, and if they capture Sverdlikovo, another village, which is located southwest of Sudzha, then the Kursk pocket that the Ukrainians have established basically is cut off from resupply, and the Ukrainians have a major crisis on their hands. So that's what the Group of Forces North are saying about the situation in Kursk. And, they are there. They're the people who are actually fighting. They should know. Now, they also, by the way, and for the record, say that another HIMARS launcher has been destroyed in this area as well. And they claim that Ukraine's own offensive in the Glushkovo area has, and I'm quoting their exact words, has finally stalled without achieving its goal. While the Ukrainian armed forces are regrouping, the Ukrainian command is considering the advisability of continuing the operation. They have taken the view that the whole Glushkovo operation has been a failure and that the Ukrainian military knows this, though they go on to say that they expect Zelensky to insist that this offensive be continued, despite the fact that it has clearly failed and has become senseless. And about that, they may be right. Now, Group of Forces North have also provided us with a very interesting account of the current situation in Volchansk. They say that in Volchansk, fierce battles continue, fearing the loss of control of the area of the multi-story buildings. The Ukrainians are actively counterattacking and transferring reinforcements. And over the course of 24 hours, we repelled 3 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces from the flour mill area in the direction of the multi-story buildings. Enemy losses amounted to 11 troops, and attempts to transfer reinforcements to the right bank of the Volcha River have been thwarted. Now that gives a further strong hint that after a long, very grinding battle with Group of Forces North apparently compelled to transfer troops to the east to contain the situation in Kursk region, the only area where I think one can speak of the Russians diverting forces from the front lines is from Kharkiv to Kursk. The 106th Airborne Guards Division was also transferred from the Siversk area, as I have previously discussed, but the only place where mechanized infantry has had to be redeployed from the original front lines was from the Kharkiv region. That fact slowed the Russian advance in Volchansk, but it looks as if, despite that redeployment, the Russians are on the brink of capturing the high-rise building area in Volchansk, which, if true, would have very dramatic consequences, apparently for the entire battle of Volchansk, and indeed for the entire situation in that part of Kharkiv region that the Russians are aiming to control. And for the record, as at this moment in time, that does not seem to include the city of Kharkiv itself. Well, elsewhere in the area of Kharkiv region, the Russians, having apparently successfully captured Makeyevka, have now moved on and have advanced southward towards the next village on the Oskol River, which is the village of Nevske, or Zherebets River. And there's now apparently pictures, photographs of Russian soldiers raising the flag in Nevske, which suggests that Nevske has also now been captured by the Russians. So it looks as if the Russians have continued to make progress in this area, and presumably they will move south towards further village of Novosadovye and ultimately to Terny and maybe to Torske as well. These are all places along the Zherebets River. Now, I should say that there is an alternative view which says that the Russians did not move towards Nevske from Makeyevka in the north, but that they advanced across the open fields and captured Nevske from the east, and that a whole belt of territory as a result between Makeyevka and Nevske has passed under Russian control. Well, I'm not in any position to confirm that, but that's what some reports are saying. And there are other reports which also say that just as the Russians have crossed the Zherebets River in the Makeyevka area and have established a bridgehead there, they have done exactly the same thing in Nevske, and that they are continuing to advance, and that they're continuing their advance west of the Zherebets River and are broadening their bridgehead, which now basically exists between Nevsky and Makeyevka. In fact, there's some claims that the Russians have actually managed to capture one or two villages west of the on the west bank of the Zherebets River, as well as Nevsky itself. So there we go. That's one report. Further north, in Kupiansk, the Russian advances around Kupiansk continue. The Russians apparently are pushing westwards towards a place called, from a village that they've captured called Pushanye, which is to the south of Kupiansk, and they're now close to the Oskol River. Apparently there's very, very heavy Russian bombing in this entire area around Kupiansk. My own view is that if what the Russians have been waiting for in this area, in the area of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, is the fall of Volchansk further north. And as I said many times, if you look at the road system, you can understand that once Volchansk comes under Russian control, the Russians can then establish road links, which will help them with their supply situation in the Kupiansk and ultimately Izium and Balakleya areas, and that will set the situation for further advances. So, major advances by the Russians in the Kharkiv area, both in Volchansk, it seems, and around the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, south of Kupiansk itself. Well, we've had less news over the last 24 hours from Seversk and Chasiv Yar, but we've had some extremely dramatic news from the Toretsk area. Yesterday, I spoke about how the Russians had broken through in the area, in the central area of Toretsk, how they have now reached the main high-rise building area in Toretsk. But we've also had reports that the Russians have advanced north from New York, which they captured 2 weeks ago, that presumably they have also captured the village of Nelipivka, though there's not exact confirmation of this. But more importantly, they've pushed even further north and captured another village which lies to the southwest of Toretsk, which is called Leonidivka. And that this entire village, this entire territory, and significant areas to the west of this territory have now passed under complete Russian control. And though this is not clear from the maps, apparently this is a continuous built-up area, and all of it has collapsed. The defenses of it have collapsed and have been captured by the Russians, again, at extraordinary speed. The military summary channel now says that if you take the entire Toretsk conurbation, by which I think what is meant is all of the areas that made up the Toretsk fortified area that the Ukrainians fully controlled up to the beginning of May of this year. The Russians now control around 70% of it. And I think that's probably true, though I think if we are talking about the town of Toretsk itself, the urban centre, right at the core of this, I think the Russians control perhaps about 20% of the territory of Toretsk city or Toretsk town, even though I accept they undoubtedly do control an awful lot more of the Toretsk urban unfortified conurbation. And the point is that they control the most important parts of it now, apart perhaps from this citadel area that they've now reached and could begin storming. And there's apparently a coal mine, the Toretsk coal mine, and a slag heap to the northeast, though that, strictly speaking, is outside the boundaries of Toretsk itself. And, well, I'm not going to try and give accurate timetables for this, but the speed of the collapse in Toretsk has been remarkable, and to my mind demolishes this whole theory that we're looking at a stable front line, or a roughly stable front line, that these are two armies in which both are to a great extent exhausted and are not able to keep up the battle. I don't see this at all. It seems to me that the fact that the Russians have been able to break through this heavily fortified area, which is Toretsk, capture so much of it so fast. Remember, this offensive only began in May, that they've now captured perhaps 2/3 or even more of it, and that they're probably in the process of bisecting it in two. Well, that tells us about the whole situation in the war. And to repeat again, if Toretsk does fall, if the town of Toretsk comes completely under Russian control at the same time, or roughly the same time, as the Russians are about to capture Chasiv Yar, and given that the Russians are already pushing west across the aqueduct from Kurdyumovka and Klashayevka, one can immediately see that the entire Ukrainian position in the town of Konstantinovka, around 70,000 people, immediately to the south of Kramatorsk, is going to become, well, undefendable. The Russians would be in a position to attack Konstantinovka from north, pushing northwards from Toretsk. The distance is not great. The Russians could also link up with their forces, pushing westwards from Kurdyumovka and Klashayevka, and they will also be in a position to attack Konstantinovka from the north, from Chasiv Yar, where they would control the high ground, and they would be able to position their artillery and their observers, and they would be able to keep constant observation over the whole of Chasiv Yar. Over the whole of Konstantinovka as well. So this is a developing crisis. It has not yet attracted the attention that the crisis around Pokrovsk has done, though I would not be surprised myself if at some point within the next few months, perhaps after Pokrovsk itself falls, once Toretsk and Chasiv Yar have also fallen, perhaps by the end of the year, it will be this area of the fighting, the area around Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk, that is attracting the greatest attention. Anyway, that brings me to what is happening around Pokrovsk. There is an article in the Washington Post, which I have not yet been able to find. The Washington Post is full of articles about the Ukraine war at the moment, most of which basically repeat each other and tell us very little new, that is new, at least not, that's how it seems to me. Anyway, there's an article apparently in the Washington Post in which a Ukrainian soldier is reported as telling the Washington Post that because of Russian shelling of the roads, Russian destruction of the road bridges, Russian destruction of the railway lines, or shelling of the railway lines, all of which I've discussed in previous programs, Pokrovsk's position as a logistical hub has now in effect ended. The town itself is under early siege. The Russians have not yet launched any specific storming operations against it, but they have effectively closed all the roads that lead to and from it. And that, by the way, inevitably is going to have an effect on the fighting further eastwards in places like Toretsk and Chasov Yar and places like that. I would not be surprised if the sudden collapse we have seen in Toretsk and the collapse we saw over the previous days in Chasov Yar is connected to a Ukrainian logistical crisis caused by the Russian investment, the virtual encirclement or artillery encirclement, if you prefer, of Pokrovsk. Anyway, in the Pokrovsk area, we've now had more news. The Ukrainians are now acknowledging that the Russians have gained control of the coal mine and slag heap located to the east of Novogrodivka. There's been a lot of discussion about who is in control of that particular slag heap and coal mine. There are the two coal mines to the north of Novogrodivka. There was some suggestions that for some time that the Ukrainians still control the western one, but it's now universally accepted that the Russians control both of the coal mines and slag heaps on the northern edge of Novogrodivka, and that they also control Kruty Yar, village to the northeast of Novogrodivka. It's now accepted that the Russians are in full control also of the coal mine and slag heap to the east of Novogrodivka as well. And I'm going to say that if this is all true, then it means that the Ukrainians are unlikely to be able to maintain their positions in the villages of Lysivka and Suhy Yar to the northeast of Novogrodivka for very long. But more importantly, it looks to me as if the Russians, if they control this coal mine and slag heap, which the Ukrainians themselves admit that they now do, they're going to be able to basically stop supplies going to Selidovo from the north and perhaps even the west. The Russians, of course, have just captured Ukrainsk, which is to the south of Selidovo. They control Mikhailovka, which is a village located immediately to the east of Selidovo. There are still some people who argue about whether the Russians control the coal mine and slag heap at the northeastern edge of Selidovo itself. I believe they do. Ukrainska Pravda, to my mind, strongly suggested that they do. But all right, I accept I'm not there. Perhaps there's alternative views about this. I'm not going to insist on the point. But the point is that the Russians undoubtedly are inside Selidovo. They have apparently advanced on Selidovo from the south, from Ukrainsk, and have apparently entered the southeastern part of Selidovo, where they were previously positioned, but from which they withdrew. They control the coal mine and slag heap to the south. They control the coal mine and slag heap to the north, the one west of Novogrodivka. They've almost certainly cut the main roads. I can't myself see how Selidovo can be defended for very much longer. I'm going to make a guess. I think the Ukrainians are going to pull out of Selidovo fairly soon. I don't really see that they have that much choice. So that's the situation there. The Russians are located immediately to the north of Tsukurinye. There's reports that the Russians have entered Sukurinya. There's reports that the Russians have entered Girnik. And of course, they control Ukrainsk. And on the topic of Ukrainsk, I would like to make a factual correction. I understand that the Russian brigade that captured Ukrainsk, is the same Russian brigade which previously captured Karlovka and Galitsinivka, and that is a former Donbass militia regiment which has been incorporated into the Russian army. I'm not sure under which group of forces it falls. I think that they are ultimately responsible to General Mordvichev's, which would mean that they were part of Group of Forces Center. But it seems to me that whereas to the north, the fighting is largely conducted by regiments of the, if you like, original regular Russian army, in Ukrainsk, the force that captured Ukrainsk is one of these regiments that have been created out of the Donbass militia. So, Selidovo looks undefendable to me. Grodivka, I am convinced, has fallen further north, near to Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, all the supply routes into and out of Pokrovsk are being shelled. Novogrodivka, securely now under Russian control. The Russians clearing the villages close to Pokrovsk, moving closer. Well, they're apparently 4 kilometers from Mirnograd, 8 to 10 kilometers from Pokrovsk, but they're shelling it systematically. This is a terrible situation, and one which is deteriorating every day. And further south, if we now turn to the situation around Kurakovo, well, there's some discussions as to how exactly the Russians captured the Selidovo prison, which is located immediately to the west of Kurakovo. Some are suggesting, the Ukrainians are suggesting, that the Russians captured this prison by advancing towards this prison from the north along the railway lines, which, if true, would presumably mean that the entire Girnik area is about to be encircled by the Russians. The alternative view is that the Russians advanced towards this prison area from the south, in which alternatively it's the Maximilianovka area, the village of Maximilianovka, where the fighting is taking place. It's that area which is going to be surrounded very soon by the Russians. I'm not sure which would be the worst outcome for the Ukrainians, to be surrounded in the north or to be surrounded in the south, but one way or the other, it looks to me as if they're likely to be surrounded in either one of these places. Perhaps the right thing to do is to withdraw from both of them, because both of these places, Maximilianova and the Girnik and other Kurakhivka and other villages or small towns in this area, all look undefendable to me. And Kurakovo itself, a town that lies on the banks of the Kurakovo reservoir, looks to me as if it is about to be encircled also. And this now brings us to the last major area where the fighting continues at the moment, which is the Vuhledar area. There's lots of reports, very confusing reports, as to what exactly is happening in the Vuhledar area. There's still some people who, I think, believe or want to believe that the Ukrainians still control part of South Donbass number 3, the coal mine, which lies between Vodyane and the village of Bogoyavlenka. I am absolutely sure that the Russians control this entire coal mine and that they've cut the road to Vuhledar. But anyway, there are reports that Ukrainian soldiers in this area, in all of these various places, are describing the situation that they find themselves in as hellish, that the Russians are in overwhelming numbers, that they're attacking in multiple directions, north from Prechystivka, that they're attacking the village of Novo-Ukrainka, that they're pushing also westwards, northwestwards from Prechystivka, looking to outflank Vuhledar from the north, join up, in other words, with their forces in South Donbass number 3 and in Vodyane, that Bogoyavlenka is under constant heavy artillery and bombing fire, and also could be stormed very soon. And apparently various Ukrainian commentators and reporters are all talking about the fact that the Ukrainians are going to have to pull out of Vuhledar very soon. Well, as I said in my program yesterday, I think they should pull out of Vuhledar and try to save what can be saved. But my own guess is that by this point, that won't be very much, because the time to do that, and to do that successfully, has now passed. So there we are. That is my quick summary of the situation on the battlefronts. We can see things are deteriorating on every front line. The Russians are continuing with their policy of advancing on every front continuously, causing cracks to appear everywhere on Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainians are having to constantly shuffle their brigades from one point to the other. Western journalists talk about how exhausted Ukrainian soldiers look and how harrowed they are by the terrible losses that they are suffering. And by the way, on that topic, the fact that there's been less news over the last 24 hours from the Siversk and Chasiv Yar areas doesn't mean that a lot isn't going on there. I've already discussed how regimes of silence often hide significant Russian advances, and there are some reports that the Russians have pushed north from Orozhanye towards the village of Velika Novosilka, which of course is located not that far from the Vuhledar area of the battlefronts. And that even more ominously, General Teplinsky and his group of forces, Dnieper, is about to be activated, and that they are now gradually pushing towards the various villages, Ukrainian-controlled villages, to the north of Rabotino, from which Ukraine's disastrous summer offensive was launched, and that the Russians supposedly are now fairly close or getting closer to villages like Malaya, Tokmachka, and other places like that, and that perhaps a Russian offensive towards Orechov, Tokmachka, Malaya, Tokmachka, and Novopokrovka, and places like that, and that the Russians might be preparing for an advance on Orechov, the town of Orechov, which, of course, if the Russians capture, shall we say that the distance from Orechov to the great city of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper is not so great. So there we go. A terrible situation right across the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, the Financial Times is saying that when Zelensky meets Biden in New York, he's going to try to explain to Biden that Biden needs to mind effectively his legacy. He made the defense of Ukraine the major factor in his the foreign policy part of his presidency. He needs to take steps now to ensure that that legacy is protected, so that whoever his successor is going to be bound up with defending Ukraine and presumably prolonging the war, and that obviously means taking all the steps that Zelensky wants him to take. Well, I hope, though I'm far from convinced, that Biden will not let himself be swayed by that kind of persuasion, because objectively, this is a war that is being lost. And if Biden does do that, if he starts saying that Zelensky and that the Ukrainians will get what they want about missile strikes deep inside Russia, if Biden faces down the Pentagon on that and gives an instruction to that effect, if Biden does indeed name a date for Ukraine to enter NATO, which is apparently what Zelensky is seeking, well, I can say as night follows day that President Biden's successor, whoever he or she is, will not thank Biden for passing what will not be a legacy, but a poisoned chalice. Now, whether, as I said, the president himself understands that, obviously I don't know. Jake Sullivan attended this extraordinary conference, the so-called Yes Conference. It's a kind of conference, I understand, arranged by the Ukrainian businessman, or oligarch, as some would say, Mr. Pinchuk, in which apparently they all discussed what to do with Ukraine, and as many have commented, there was very little new thinking there. Anyway, Jake Sullivan was there. He again insisted, and I found this really deeply depressing, that negotiations in Ukraine can only happen on the basis of what Ukraine wants. They can only take place with Ukraine, in effect tying the hands of the United States, giving Zelensky and his officials a veto on any diplomatic move by the United States to settle the war. I would like to believe that Jake Sullivan said that purely in order to differentiate the administration's position from that of the Republican challenger, who is talking about his own peace plan. The fact is that negotiations have to begin if a disaster, a geopolitical disaster, is to be averted or at least mitigated. And as is absolutely clear now, that negotiation can only be conducted by the United States. Ukraine is not able to do it. The European Union, European governments are fragmented and uncertain about what to do. And if we're talking about the EU Centre, the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen appears to be going out of her way to give top positions within the Commission to extreme hardliners, not just Kaja Kallas, who's due to take over from Josep Borrell, but other people of that kind in other positions as well. So we're not going to get negotiations from the Europeans. We're not going to get negotiations from the Ukrainians. I can't see how that can happen. The only party, even by the way, Mark Galeotti, appears to acknowledge that the Ukrainians are incapable of conducting the kind of negotiations that might end this war. The only party capable of breaking the deadlock is the United States. But realism about the situation, as I discussed at the start of this program, is now essential, though there is little of it, it must be said, in terms of the administration and its outliers in sight. Now, this is becoming all the more pressing because we can see in the Middle East that there are now repeated exchanges of fire across the Lebanon border. The situation there remains incredibly tense. The Israelis successfully killed a top Hezbollah, I'm going to call him Special Forces figure, though many would balk at my talking about a unit of a militia group, which some people would say militia is too soft a word to describe Hezbollah. Some would balk at my calling any unit of that organization a special forces unit, but in effect, it seems to me that is what it was. Anyway, the commander of that unit has apparently been killed in an airstrike, and the Israelis are claiming, quite plausibly, that in fact the entire command of the unit was also killed, which will be demoralizing for the unit, but not, in my opinion, or at least not as far as I can see, fundamental in changing the course of whatever battle might be coming. And Hezbollah, for its part, is apparently now launching its own rockets now more purposefully into Israel. The situation there is becoming very tense, and as a number of Russian commentators are saying, if the war does escalate and Israel does start needing more munitions and equipment, it will have no choice but to turn to the United States, and the United States, already short of weapons to keep Ukraine supplied, but committed to defending Israel or supporting Israel, is going to have to prioritize, I don't think there's any doubt about this, Israel over Ukraine, compounding Ukraine's problems even further. The president and his advisors, when they meet with Zelensky, ought to be keeping all this in mind. In international affairs, everything is connected to everything else. This is more true of this present time than it has ever been. And if the president doesn't see that, he will compound, in my opinion, the mistakes which have already been made. But anyway, I doubt that he listens to my advice. I'm sure his officials don't either. We'll just have to wait and see what he will do. And in the meantime, whatever it is that he does and how it turns out, I will be here to continue to comment about it. But this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and the others. You can support our work via Patreon and subscribe. Star links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop, and also, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Next program from Malaysia. Have a very good day.